We're here today to do a little bit of a presentation on a very interesting topic. I'm sure some of you have probably had questions about things come up, and that's impairment in the workplace. And it's really a big deal. And of course, this was really brought to light with the legalization of cannabis back in October, right? Everybody's first thought is, okay, great, the government just made marijuana legal. So now we got to worry about that in the workplace. But I want you to think about this for a second. It was legalized, right? It was legalized for recreational use. But has it really changed anything at work? Do you think? Not really. Have we always had some sort of policy or whatnot in place that talks about things like drugs and alcohol? I would say so, right? The majority of us have. So this is something that's really not too much different than that. However, one of the things that this legalization brought to light is what can an employer do? What can a supervisor do when it comes to dealing with these types of concerns in the workplace? So we think to ourselves, when it comes to impairment, we believe somebody's impaired. The question is, what do you do? What can I do and what can I do? A lot of supervisors primarily, but employers as well, are concerned about, okay, well, can I tell them this? What are the repercussions? Can I say this? Are there issues with human rights? Those sorts of things. So those are some of the things that have come to light. But ultimately, it's actually very easy to control. The biggest part that we need to know about is how to identify these things in the first place. Has anyone in here ever dealt with that in the workplace before? Either you're with somebody in your workplace or something that you know of that you believe was impaired. Has anyone, hands up for anyone who's dealt with that? Okay. So in those types of scenarios, what do you do? Or what did you do? How about yourself? Okay, send it back to the room. Okay, all right, fair enough. What's a really common thought? Somebody comes to work impaired. What are you going to let them work? Probably not, if you suspect that, right? So what would you say to that person? In your case, you said, go back to your room, okay? But a really, one that we have to be very careful of is saying to the person, okay, well, you know what? You're impaired today, so I'm not going to allow you to work, so you got to go home, right? So you're done for the day. What's the problem with that? They're going to drive. If we believe they're impaired by allowing that person to get behind the wheel of a car and go home, what are we doing? It is a huge liability. It can be, right? So that's not something that we would normally do. We have to treat that a little bit differently. But we do have the ability to handle these types of situations. So with this legalization coming to light, we created a program that was called Reasonable Suspicion. And the idea behind this program is to help those supervisors and employers, first of all, identify what impairment is in the workplace and what it includes, the different things, right? The different elements. The different drugs that are available, the different signs to watch for some of those individuals, because we need to be aware of those things. And that's really one of the big questions. You know, how do we identify this? If we identify it, what do we do, right? And of course, how do we prove that we've done something about it? When we talk about safety in the workplace, we typically refer back to what we call the 5 Ds. You've all heard of due diligence before, right? You've probably all heard that saying. So the 5 Ds is due diligence is demonstrated through documentation and discipline. Those are the only ways that we can prove that we can show that we're enforcing something. And of course, we have to document everything when it comes to health and safety in the workplace. So let's look at that new cannabis law that came out in October. So there was a few things, a couple of things with this law that I don't really agree with. Number one, they made it legal for anybody who's essentially the age of drinking and whatnot can use this in Ontario, right? Currently, it's only available for purchase online, and who knows, they're going to change that later this year, and they're going to come out with things like edibles and all kinds of stuff. But it goes a little bit beyond that. So in addition to those things that are coming down the road, now you can actually grow these things at home. And probably the provincial government's biggest mistake, and I'm not sure why they did this, but you're allowed to smoke cannabis anywhere that you can smoke cigarettes. Is there anything wrong with that? Anyone find anything wrong with that at all? You could be walking down the street, and just walking down the street, you might pass how many people that have a joint lit up or something like that because they're able to do it. Now, fortunately, municipalities have the ability to restrict its use in public places, right? And the bulk of the majorities are likely going to do that. Some of them already have. They've already restricted its use in certain areas. But it creates confusion in the workplace. Do all of your companies in here, do you allow smoking in the workplace, in designated areas? Okay. So what do you think some of those employees' thoughts are now that, they know you can smoke in this area, it's a designated smoking area, and it's legal to smoke cannabis where you smoke something like cigarettes. So what are an employee's impression? That they might be able to do that as well, even at work, when in fact we do have the ability to restrict those types of things. In terms of legalization, does this affect your workplace? Is it something that you need to be aware of, right? And how do you deal with these situations when there is somebody who's potentially impaired? Those are our big concerns. Now, we have safety laws in Ontario, right? We have the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Hands up for anybody who's seen that awesome green book before. Okay, so we got a bunch of hands. Okay, cool. How many of you have read it? No? Oh, come on, it's entertaining stuff. It's on your night table. Okay. So it's a little boring, it's a little dry, and it's completely open to interpretation. It doesn't make it the most entertaining stuff in the world. But do you think there's actually some valuable information in there if you understand those interpretations? Is there some value to it? Now, our safety laws don't mention anything specific about impairment in the workplace. The Ministry of Labor has published some guidelines that can be followed in your workplace with regards to impairment. They don't specify cannabis specifically, they say impairment, but these things only came out as a result of the legalization of cannabis, right? But there's nothing in the law that actually says how to control it, what it is that you need to do. So it's essentially left up to us, to the employers, to the supervisors, to determine how we're going to deal with these things. But ultimately, you think the Ministry of Labor is going to hold us accountable if something happens as a result of impairment? So because of that, we need to deal with it. We need to know, what do we do? What can we do? What steps do we take to make sure that we protect our workers? Those two D words, due diligence, they're taken from one of the employer's responsibilities, and supervisors, right? To take every precaution reasonable in the circumstance to protect a worker. So when it comes to something like impairment, is it a reasonable precaution that we have something in place to protect our workers from those who might be impaired? And to protect those impaired workers to make sure they don't hurt themselves? Absolutely. We definitely need to have something like that in place. So this is an example of the Ministry of Labor's page on impairment in the workplace, where it outlines some of the things that you should do. But one of the things that it does make mention is that you have to have policies and programs in place in order to deal with these things. Those things need to be there. They need to be in place so we can control these things. Now, regardless as to what the law says about smoking cannabis in areas where you can still smoke cigarettes and whatnot, as the employer, we still have the ability to restrict its use in the workplace. The same way we do for smoking and of course vaping now, which is also covered under the Smoke-Free Ontario Act, right? So it follows the exact same rules, away from entrances, those sorts of things. There's been some more definition to this. I would imagine a good majority of you in here may have commercial vehicles at your facilities, right? Transport trucks, those sorts of things. It's a zero tolerance for having any of this stuff, any drugs or alcohol in your system whenever you're going to be operating a commercial vehicle. When it comes to something like cannabis, how long do you think cannabis would stay in your system for? 7? You can get, even 7 days after use, you can get a really good trace of it, but 30 days, absolutely. Now, in this case here, when it comes to commercial operators, let's say somebody smokes some cannabis or something like that on a Saturday, and they go to work on a Monday, chances are they're not impaired, but the THC can still be picked up in their system, right? The only time something like that is going to become an issue with a commercial driver is in the event that they get into an accident or whatnot. One of the things that the OPP officers are going to do is, when it's a commercial operator, they're going to have them usually do a drug test fairly quickly. And that's something that they can order. That's not something that we can just do that easily, but they can do it like that. It doesn't take them long, right? And if they find any amount, any traces of THC in their system and whatnot, then they can look at potential impaired charges as well, if they believe that that was partially responsible for it. So that's the reason why they put a zero tolerance on commercial operators, it's a very difficult one to regulate, because we're not monitoring what commercial operators are doing at home on weekends. The same with regular staff, right? We're not necessarily monitoring that. We don't know. The employer, of course, is required to take every precaution reasonable in these circumstances. So who can tell me what is a reasonable precaution? So a reasonable precaution is essentially defined as going above minimum standards to protect a worker. So that lovely green book that we've all seen and we've all read, in there, it outlines a whole bunch of safety laws that we have to follow, but it doesn't get into everything specifically. What we do that goes beyond those standards is considered to be a reasonable precaution. So would you say that it's a reasonable precaution that we should have policies and procedures put in place to control these things? Right? For your supervisors, if your supervisors come across a worker who believe is impaired, a question to ask yourself, and even for those of you in here that are supervisors, do you know what to do if you come across somebody who's impaired? Do you know what you should do? Do you document whatever it is you do? Right? So those are things that you need to take into consideration. I'm gonna show you some stuff, and I'll show you a link as well that you can go to download a sample of a policy and a procedure, including investigation reports, that sort of thing, that you might be able to use in your own workplaces. Okay? An employer should be assessing the circumstances to identify any hazards that might be present in the workplace. They have a responsibility to make sure that they enforce the rules with their workers and they keep their workers safe, right? Now, for any of you who are in here as supervisors, do you know your staff, your workers fairly well? Would you say? Would you be able to identify when something about those individuals is off, is different on any given day? They're not their normal person. Maybe they're happier than what they normally are, in which case, who knows, maybe that could be considered a form of impairment or a sign, right? Or maybe they're not, or maybe it's the exact opposite. Maybe they're not walking right. Maybe they're slurring the words. There's all kinds of different things that we can look at, but probably the biggest part to identifying impairment in the workplace is knowing your staff. So what you have to establish is you have to establish a baseline. If you don't know your staff, you don't necessarily know how they normally behave. But if you know them, you develop and establish a baseline for how they normally behave, and then anything that goes above or beyond that might be a little bit of a sign for you to investigate it a little bit further. So this not only includes about assessing hazards and whatnot in the workplace, but ensuring that workers are not impaired while they're performing their work, and that if anyone's potentially impaired or if somebody's doing something dangerous, that we're addressing those. So if there's hazards that are around any workers that we believe are impaired, right? Any of those things, we have to assess that stuff. Okay? Now, a general duty is also imposed on constructors and supervisors. So supervisors have the need to take every precaution reasonable as well. So when it comes to policies and procedures, they're responsible to enforce these things. But constructors on construction sites, and I would imagine almost everyone in here goes onto construction sites, a lot of those constructors, they all have that responsibility to ensure that the health and safety of the workers on any project is protected. Now, that's all the legislation says. They have to make sure the health and safety of workers on a project is protected. Really, that encompasses pretty much everything, right? They have a responsibility to be looking out for these things as well, to try and identify when workers are doing things that they shouldn't be, and perhaps there's a reason for that. May even come down to impairment being one of those reasons. Under occupational health and safety, the employer and supervisor share this responsibility to provide information and instruction to their workers to protect them. They need to know, as an organization, that these policies and procedures that we have are not to be taken lightly. We have to take them seriously. And they need to know in advance that we're going to be enforcing these things. Right? So that's going to be a big one. The employers have the duty to maintain a policy and a procedure as well. So that's one of their responsibilities under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. They have to have a health and safety policy, and they have to have a program to implement that policy. Now, again, very, very generic. The Occupational Health and Safety Act doesn't tell us what a program is. It's up to us to determine what a program is and how to implement those things. one of the things we know we have to have a health and safety policy statement, right? That's just a statement of intent and commitment towards health and safety in the workplace. We have a violence and harassment policy statement. Same kind of idea. Have you ever thought about having a policy statement posted for impairment in the workplace? To give a general overview to your workers that they can read at any given time. They can go and look at to determine, okay, I know what the employer is going to be doing, so these things I probably can't do, right? So having something like an impairment policy statement posted in addition to those other statements is a pretty important thing because it's a means of providing that information to your workers in order to keep them safe. That's just part of it. You've got a program that makes that up as well. But that program is typically brought out through enforcement with supervisors, through employers, through safety talks with everybody, those sorts of things. But we do want to make sure we have some of those. Now, the workers, they have responsibilities as well, right? What's a responsibility that a worker has with regards to occupational health and safety? Not impaired, of course, that's what we're talking about, right? They need to be fit for duty. They need to be in the right frame of mind. And you know what, when we talk about impairment in the workplace, what are the first things that usually come to mind when we talk about impairment? Number one is alcohol, right? And would everybody in here, for the most part, say that alcohol, when somebody's drinking, it's usually pretty easy to identify? Usually you get a smell or coming off their breath, or you'll be able to see their actions, right? So we think of alcohol. What else? Okay, so then that's the one. Fatigue is the one that's normally not covered in a lot of these policies, right? And we're not going to call it fatigue, right? How many of you are tired in here right now? Okay, there's probably some. That's why there's coffee and everything, right? But there's a difference between fatigue, or being tired, which can sometimes be seen as fatigue, and what we'll call extreme fatigue. Extreme fatigue is the terminology that the OPP uses in order to define impairment by being tired as opposed to alcohol and drugs, right? So they use that term, extreme fatigue. Extreme fatigue is when somebody's been up for really long periods of time, or there's so many things going on in their life, emotional stress, financial stress, all of those things, they can wear a person down. I would imagine everybody in here at some point has gone through those either maybe a financial hard time or an emotional hard time or those sorts of things. And what kind of effects do those play on you as a person? They're huge. Right? So extreme fatigue is often the one that's left out of a lot of these policies. So when we have ours created, it's created to include fatigue, which is the reason why we call it impairment, because fatigue is actually considered to be a type of impairment. So a lot of workers, when it comes to different types of impairment, be it drugs, alcohol, or even extreme fatigue, a lot of times some of those things can be resolved or at least helped by just talking to them, right? Open door policies, wellness programs, EAPs, those sorts of things, employee assistance programs, right? Those things are resources that are available to help employees with these things. So when it comes to something like that, when it comes to substance abuse, let's say, as opposed to just smoking a joint or actual substance abuse, do we have any obligation, if they tell us that they have some sort of issue with substance abuse, do we have an obligation to help them wherever we can? Absolutely. We want our employees to get better. We want our employees to do well at work. If our employees do well, we do well. The company does well. It's a win-win for the most part, right? So which is why it's important to know your staff, to establish that baseline, and when you identify that something is off, then to try and address that. So the workers, they have to show up fit for duty, but they have some other responsibilities under health and safety legislation that kind of relate to impairment as well. So they're not allowed to use or operate any equipment, machine, device, or thing, or work in a way that endangers themselves or anybody else. So let me ask you a question. What's a thing? Anybody tell me what a thing is? It's one of those lovely words that they put in legislation. Really, it means anything. Anything and everything. They're not allowed to use or operate anything that's going to endanger themselves or anybody else. If somebody is impaired in the workplace, or if we believe somebody is impaired, there's a certain expectation that the Ministry of Labor has of the supervisors in the workplace. So the first thing they're going to ask, so let's say somebody was impaired and something happened in the workplace. The first thing they're going to ask to a supervisor is, were you aware of this? Okay? And as a supervisor, you might say, okay, well, you know, I know Joe had something at lunch or whatnot, but I did my investigation, and even though this is what I was told, he seemed perfectly fine. All right, I asked him a whole bunch of questions. He answered me straight out. He doesn't seem to have anything going on with his job. He's not really doing anything wrong that I can see. So I did my investigation. And here, I documented my investigation. Here's a copy of it. If you investigate when you have that suspicion and you document your investigation, have you taken every precaution reasonable to protect your workers? And the answer is yes. So we're talking about policies and procedures, and those are something that need to be in place. So we need to have some of those things. So alcohol and drug policy, that's what it all started with. Alcohol and drug policies have been in place for years, right? But you have to ask, is that what you really need? Right? Does an alcohol and drug policy cover everything? I would say that there's one thing that's left out of a drug and alcohol policy. What do you think that is? Extreme fatigue is typically left out of these types of policies. So instead, that's why we suggest calling it an impairment policy and procedure, because impairment encompasses everything, right? Encompasses all kinds of different elements, right? Prescribed, illicit, and recreational drug use. It would cover alcohol, and it would cover extreme fatigue. So a big question comes up is, what if somebody has a prescription for cannabis use for medicinal purposes? All right, so what are the rules around that? So the first thing to know is, number one, there is no such thing as a prescription for cannabis use. The only thing that happens is the doctor, if the doctor believes that cannabis use might aid in whatever medical issue is going on, what they're going to do is they're essentially going to issue a letter saying that you are authorized to use it for medicinal purposes. But it's not a prescription. And the reason is it doesn't tell you what strain. It doesn't tell you how much to take. It doesn't tell you how often to take it. It simply says that you're authorized to take it for medicinal use. That's it. Right? So, when it comes to cannabis, are there forms of cannabis that do not cause impairment? So CBD is a common aid that's used for things like epilepsy, for anxiety. It helps a lot with those things. It's a natural medication. But the one thing about CBD is it does not actually cause impairment. Now, most CBD medications come with a small amount of THC in them as well. I guess apparently the THC is needed to make the CBD a little bit more active, right? But it doesn't actually cause a form of impairment. So what would you do if a worker comes up to you and says, well, I have a prescription for using cannabis, but it's CBD only? Now, remember, when we're dealing with prescriptions, when we're dealing with things that are done for medicinal purposes, oftentimes we have what's called the duty to accommodate. Now, that's not something that we like to get into too much, but it does exist. In the event that somebody is using something like that for medicinal purposes because of some sort of ailment that they have, we do have that duty to accommodate them as much as possible. When it comes to something like CBD, it doesn't cause a form of impairment, so more than likely, something like that could be used in the workplace for doing whatever job they might be doing. It depends on the risk of the job that they're going to be doing. Okay? If it's a high-risk environment, they might not even be able to use that. So when we have to do an investigation, what are some things you might want to keep in mind when you're doing that investigation? How would you do it? So would you just go and start your investigation talking to that person in front of all their workers and whatnot? Would you do that? Why not? Confidentiality issues, right? So the way that you treat investigations into impairment is very, very similar in how you would treat investigations into violence and harassment occurring in your workplaces as well. It has to be confidential, right? You take the person to a quiet room. You sit them down. You talk to them. Essentially, this whole program is a step-by-step guide in what to do. How to identify it, so the different things to look for. How to investigate it. The disciplinary actions that are going to be taken, the training that's going to be given to workers to make sure they're all familiar with these things. So this is the website here. I don't know if it's up to you if you want to write that down or if you want to take a picture of it. But this is a website where we have a sample copy of a policy and a sample copy of a program that you can download. And this is available in Microsoft Word. So you can actually edit this one and you can put in your names and whatnot. So this is an example of the impairment investigation form that we have. So this impairment investigation form, it's very similar to a form that's used by provincial police. Provincial police, essentially, in order to determine whether somebody is impaired, they go through a questionnaire. It's about 85 questions or so that they have to answer in order to determine if somebody is impaired and what kind of charges they're going to lay. So this is a little bit of information taken out of that OPP investigation report and put into a standalone investigation report. So it starts off here with the employee's name, with the date of the incident, the description of actual or suspected incident. How did the person initiate the investigation, come to realize the worker may be impaired? So it could be a report from another worker. It could be just simply your own observation, right? Who was the person? What was their role within the organization? And then there's a series of questions here, and these are just meant to help the supervisor draw a conclusion about their suspicions, okay? So, has the worker admitted to taking any kind of alcohol or drug use, or any kind of drugs or alcohol? So this is a challenging one, right? What's going to happen if you go, hey, Joe, you been taking any drugs or drinking any alcohol today? How's that going to go over? Do you really think anybody's going to answer that? They're essentially incriminating themselves if they did, right? So we do want to know if they've admitted to taking those things, but going up to somebody with a direct question like that is probably not going to get you the answer you're looking for. You're probably going to get a no. So how could you ask the same thing but approach it differently? Or you could just simply say, yeah, how are things going today? No, I just wanted to check in with you and, kind of see how your job's going today. How's things going on at home? That sort of thing. Just initiating a simple conversation might give you the ability to identify as to whether or not they may be impaired based on what some of their responses are. Now, then you want to look at their behavior. So, are they nervous? So is it possible that you pull somebody into a room, just you and them, that they might be a little bit nervous as to why they're in there? I would say so. And to a certain extent, that might be normal. Going beyond that, are they any unusual actions? So are they sweating? So sweating excessively. I mean, depending on what work is being done, sweating might not be a sign of anything, but it might be a sign of something, right? If they're sweating and they're just sitting at their desk. Looking at their speech. So is their speech slurred? Are they talking slow? Do they seem confused when they're talking to you? Is it thick? Is it rambling? Is it pressured? What about their balance? So, are they falling over? So if they stand up and they fall over, or they're falling, they have to lean up against something, like they have to consistently lean up against something like a chair or whatever it might be. Could that be a sign that they're impaired? Could that be a sign of anything else? A stroke. That's where I was going with that. Very much so. It could be a sign of a stroke, as well as memory, and there's other things that can lead to that as well. Staggering or unsteady on their feet, unsure of anything, they need support, stumbling, or are they normal? All right, so those are all things that we want to have a look at. Their eyes and their appearance. So are their eyes bloodshot? So if eyes are bloodshot, that could be a very clear indicator of impairment, right? But bloodshot eyes could be caused by other things as well, right? It could be caused by fatigue also, right? Lack of sleep, those sorts of things. So those are things that you want to keep an eye on. Are the pupils dilated? Are they unsure? Pupils dilated are typically an indicator of some sort of substance that they might have in their system, whether it's prescription-based, recreational use, who knows? But that's something that you want to keep an eye out for. What about sobriety tests? So if you get to the point where you're considering doing these tests, to be honest, you can stop right there because you've already made a determination that you believe they're impaired. You don't need to actually go through and do those tests. Now, those tests are there, and they're in the investigation report if you want to use them. Those are the tests that the police officers use, the police force uses. Okay? So you can use them, you can do them, but a worker can say no to those. And ultimately, it's my opinion that if you get to the point where you're going to perform those tests, you've already made your determination as to if you believe this person is impaired or not, and you don't have to go to that extent. Some other stuff that's in here is extreme fatigue, a factor in this person's possible impairment. Extreme fatigue is typically something that we can identify on their own. We don't necessarily have to ask them questions about it, but we can usually identify that. Has the worker done something that would be considered unsafe? If they've done something that they consider unsafe, it's either perhaps that's the way they've been doing it for 40 years and nobody's going to tell them how to do it any different because they're the experienced worker, right? Or they're doing it that way because they've forgotten things because maybe they are impaired. Or maybe their judgment is impaired because they're extremely fatigued and they're forgetting to take certain steps. If impairment is evident, would the worker be at risk to themselves if they were allowed to continue working? So that comes down to an assessment of the job that they're doing. If a worker is impaired, if they're in a high-risk position, they shouldn't be doing that job if you consider them impaired. If impairments determine what would be contributing factors, we do want to try and identify contributing factors with any hazard that exists in the workplace. Every hazard has a contributing factor. People, equipment, materials, processes, the environment, all kinds of different things. So we want to identify those contributing factors in an effort to see if we can change or help them get rid of some of those so it doesn't happen again. And then we want to interview witnesses as well. Right? We want to get a viewpoint from other individuals as well. If this person reported this person and that's why you're doing an investigation, it's important to talk to both parties. All right? I would encourage you to take that investigation report back to your workplace, right? Compare it to what you have that already exists, right? And see if you can take something like that and adapt it into your current program, or if you can simply just implement this one if it doesn't need to be adapted. Well, I guess thanks very much for having me.